Does anyone deserve to die? Never ask a murderer. Never ask the justice system. Never ask anyone who ain't loving living. Black and white facts of life Manichaean. No way to stand between them, so you're standing leaning at the edge. Reporters recording, lights and cameras beaming. You feel like you want to jump and land on freedom. But I can show you a different freedom, though it still involves a little bit of leaping. Past inner demons, past nether regions of doubt, to the one and only living, breathing God, while all jumps become jumps for joy. A bright light fills up the void and you feel healed. Too romantic for you? Well, I invite you in. See for yourself what new life begins. People's godlike likeness is the righteousness of Christian discipleship. Still too romantic for you? Okay, well, what brings you in the mix here? It ain't much we can't discuss with all these crucifixes. You're here to show us the way? Oh, you're here to blow us away. Confederate flags, Southern heritage jazz, leave us dead where we stand, tow us away. You came for a race war, point blank, just to see niggas bleed, to let that trigger squeeze white supremacy, so you can reclaim your place atop the totem pole on this golden globe, everyone with Aryan chromosomes, huh? But there's some things you ought to know. First, one's heritage is inherited from the genetics of one's parents and not from a piece of fabric. Cut from the same cloth is just an expression, man. You remain tied, if not enslaved to some lost cause narrative in search of where it went. In Charleston, you've become the original gun clapper, an American terrorist. Second, you should know these 9 lives. Our beauty, our persistence in the living right. Despite falling down, we get back up time to time on the timeline. Our determination in gaining access to the divine line. The great things the great king is playing for a lifetime. Right on the horizon. And lastly, you should know, I understand, man. Being married to a symbol that shapes the shape of the world you assemble. The difference is for yours, you're willing to kill. For mine, I'm willing to live. Better yet, willing to save. I'm for church gatherings, you're for church massacres, church bombings, warmongering, convinced the myths of some hermetic curse on us. You're still waiting for your cause to rise again, while mine, he already rose. See, we were straight sinners till we would change with this blood and drink living water full of thanksgiving and eternal life. We were saved with it. So whether it's race wars, holy wars, or spiritual wars, attacking our physical forms, we live in the Lord, so the weapons really can't kill us. And even when they do the autopsy, Shamalataya, they gon' find a lot of agape. So though you've decided this is a day to go, I've decided to ask God to save your soul.
And how powerful is that? Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. And you've just been listening to our guest today, Dr. Dweston Haywood, who is a history professor at Hunter College and also the author of a fascinating new book called Let Us Make Men, the 20th Century Black Press and a Manly Vision for Racial Advancement. And we will talk about that in just a minute. It is a fascinating book, Dweston. Thank you so much for being with us today. I do want to start looking at and examining the poem that you've just gifted us with. As we record this, we are more than a week after the death of George Floyd and after protests in dozens of cities across this country. We have all been forced in many ways to watch the death leaving, the life leaving George Floyd. It's still upsetting to me, as you can tell. Talk to us about the poem. It's called Isaiah 54:17. And for those who know the Bible, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. So talk to us. Where are we, Dweston?
Yeah, so that poem speaks to a moment in 2015 when Dylan Roof massacred Mother Emanuel AME Church. I'm a member of the AME faith, right? Speaks to that moment, and I'm sure we'll talk about all the ways in which it's related to today. So that was an event that took place in 2015 that we're still wrestling with today. And it imagines the Reverend Clementa Pinckney speaking to Dylan Roof before the massacre takes place. And if he had a moment to explain himself, his church, his parishioners, and his perspective before his life was snatched from him, that is what that poem imagines.
Well, it's quite incredible, and speaks to where we are today. There's so many of us who say that we feel as if we're in a moment that we've never been in, and it might be his death, the protests, on top of a pandemic that makes and a president, you know, issuing very strange statements that makes us feel that we are so close to an apocalypse. Is that the way you experience this? You're a historian, though, so you've seen it.
Things look different to historians, even when we haven't lived through that moment. Our study compels us to. But I also think we are living in an unprecedented moment. I think it occurs on two planes, one in which this is a reminder of the past, but it's also something new. I think what makes it unprecedented is it's happening amid a pandemic. Though for Black people, it's a new pandemic for an old pandemic. That old pandemic being racism and white supremacy, right? And we thought that COVID might provide a break from racial violence, but it didn't. In fact, it compounded it. And so the other part that makes it unprecedented too is that we're seeing allies like we've never seen before across the country and across the globe. There's a glimmer of hope that this could translate into a broader, wider movement that really dismantles racism and white supremacy in ways that we haven't seen before. So we've gone through a war on poverty. We've gone through a war on drugs, a war on terrorism. I think now we're fighting a war on racism. And
finally, yeah, as we're finally in 2020 getting around to fighting that war on racism. Much of this has to do with the police state, you know, with police who were responsible for George Floyd's death.
Yeah.
At this point, only one has been indicted and arrested, 3 remain at large. We expect there to be movement in the case, but I think the outrage of our being forced in a way to watch someone die right before our eyes, you know, with someone's knee on someone's neck. I mean, it's just, you know, outrageous. I mean, does this finally begin to bring police force actors to a reckon that they have not had before?
I hope so. I think the protesters are trying to sustain a movement, build a movement and sustain that movement. Well beyond, you know, I think people initially thought this was going to last about 1 day or 2. I think protesters are really trying to push to make it last as long as it needs to not only bring charges against the other 3 officers, but also to begin a conversation and real policy change around criminal justice reform and policing in this country. And then I hope to move that discussion and results to a conversation and commentary and movement around human rights, and to make international appeals to an international community that can also, as we're seeing across the globe, support this effort. To us, to Black folk, this is a long-standing rerun, right? We have seen the filmography of Black death too many times. We could have settled this back in 2015 or 2017. We could have settled this back in 2015. We could have settled it in 2014, 2012, 1991, 1968, 1619, right?
Right,
So
all the way back to the very beginning, right?
So the point I'm making is for Black folk, from their standpoint epistemology, from our lens, this is a rerun that we have been trying to removed from public consciousness, but at the same time make the point to the public that this has to stop. And I think there's a boiling point, there's a tipping point, there's a fever pitch. I think protesters, Black and white, and other allies are beyond the point of fear. I think their greatest fear at this point is inaction, not acting and letting this moment pass until there's another rerun, right?
I think that we saw in the very beginning, as the protests started, that there seemed to be more than in any previous episode that we've been through, a diversity of protesters, you know, both good and, shall we say, bad. You know, the sort of infiltration that we're also used to in the history of Black Americans and protest movements. So talk to us a little bit about that, and understanding that others may be using this opportunity to create chaos, you know, from the right and from the left.
Right, so public protest is always a double-edged sword, because for the mass scale that we're seeing, as we might be reminded of mass scales that we saw in the 1960s, anyone can join, right? And anyone can pose as a protester. There's no one checking ID at the entrance of the protest, right? They're not checking ideological ID either to see what their motivations are in coming, right?
So, although that might be a good idea, impractical, but a good idea.
Right. So it's to make the point that anyone can be there. I was suspicious of some of the looting and the burnings from jump, because it seemed to me a little too specific in ways that I hadn't seen before as a historian, that is. But I think too, this is where the Black press became crucial during the time period that my book examines. And I'm just using this as an example. I think there are different forms of media now that people are really trying to use and mobilize and utilize in ways that are unprecedented as well. But for the Black press over the course of the 20th century, they tried to give form and substance to rally points around that could give an organized base to protest. That happened in very complicated ways. It happened in conflictual ways too over time, depending on the region of the country that you're looking at, depending on who the publisher was, depending on who the readers were. And so the Black press tried to influence the public sphere and the Black public sphere to generate momentum behind rally points. We're starting to see that now. I think protesters, when they began, they knew what the cause was. I think now that we're about a week in, a little over a week in, people are beginning to draw connections that take it to the next level, where we're talking now about police reform, criminal justice reform, and the militarization of police, that it produces police forces that encourage a police state. And that is how Black folk. Yeah,
right. Yeah, so we don't so much have the Black press anymore to do that, at least in a very visible way. Black press, of course, I mean, the Black podcasts, the social media, you know, the way people are using social media is incredible. And in fact, I noted reading your book that the Black press began to decline when it was the activists who were forming the basis for protest rather than the newspapers. They felt that they had fallen back in terms of really articulating it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it's a dialogue that doesn't always go evenly. You have the publishers who respond to what's happening in the streets, and then you have the people in the streets who respond to the publishers. And oftentimes it could be a willing conversation, and sometimes it's a rejection. And so I detailed this throughout the book, and I think we're seeing that now in our current moment, where you'll have people come out, leaders, political leaders, influencers, as they're being called, others who are trying to speak to what's happening. And in a lot of ways too, the protesters have rejected some of that because it's not working.
Right.
It's maybe also that we're at a point where people have exhausted every available option, right? And what happens when the Constitution is exposed for its limits? What do people do at that point?
Right.
And I think
Right.
that's what the protesters, not the other parties who've joined and hijacked the protests. I'm talking about the protesters who are out there trying to connect the dots between what happened to Floyd, what happened to Arbery in Georgia, what happened to Taylor in
Breonna Taylor, of course, right? A
right,
woman shot
a woman
8 times in her own home.
her private space, right?
Right.
That's no different from all of the other times that we've seen in this last decade of police violence and vigilante violence against Black people by people who think they are police.
Right. It's so interesting, your book, and one of the reasons I was drawn to it when I first saw it. First of all, I love the concept of the Black press, but what I had never understood, the case that you make, is that what the Black press was attempting to do, and in many ways succeeded in doing, was creating, I don't want to say glorified, but a dignified version of a Black man. To, I might add, the exclusion of Black women who became invisible throughout history until now, because the focus of the Black press was on, Black men, the focus of mainstream press was on white people, and no one was paying attention to Black women. So talk to us about this formation of who the Black man was supposed to be.
Right. What I show in the book is that there's no one single answer, and that model, whatever that masculinity was, changed dramatically over time. So what we see in the early 20th century, the early 1900s, looked vastly different by the 1960s and the 1970s. And you're right that, as I point out in the book, that what this almost myopic focus on the construction of a proper Black masculinity, what that did was it undermined a broader, to a great extent, undermined a broader liberation fight that could have brought in other voices, those voices being Black women, those voices being our gay brothers and sisters who had as much to contribute in terms of activism and in terms of ideas and writ large. So I try to profile the costs and contributions of the Black press, the ones that we typically hear about, but also like what we lost, and why we might be at a moment like 2020, because if we continue to silence certain voices, we miss the broad fight. Everyone who can contribute as soldiers, to use this martial metaphor, but contribute as activists, as thinkers, as artists, so on and so forth, that can really make this so broad and robust that we finally topple this thing called racism and white supremacy.
Right, but what seems to be true, even in our recent instances, that Breonna Taylor was killed before George Floyd was, although we did not witness that the way, we have. I mean, it's so disturbing to me that, that I don't want to say we became accomplices. We certainly would be accomplices if we did not speak up, and I think that that's what most people got. I saw this, even if I was not actually standing on the street, I saw it, so I have to do something. But most of it has to do still about Black men and not about Black women or brown women, and so talk to us about that. What drives that?
As I point out in the book, one thing that is central to politics, in this case, Black politics, but I would say politics across the board for any group of people, what is central is that men figure not only as leaders, but that the restoration, the redemption of manhood is crucial to what we conceptualize as politics and organizing.
Wow, the redemption of manhood.
And if we don't make that a crucial tenet of that organizing, we don't have a movement. So what you're pointing out is that if this was a movement about a Rakia Boyd, about a Breonna Taylor, about a Sandra Bland, and as the list goes on, Say Her Name was an effort to make that point. And
Yeah,
still
Kimberly Crenshaw's organization and huge movement to get people to pay attention to all of the women, you know, who've been murdered by police and by others as well.
Exactly. So when we start to see mobilization is when Black men are the focal point. And that, as I detail in the book, can play out in very positive ways and very problematic ways too. And it's up to us in our current moment to check those things and contain them and correct them, right? So that we get a broad-based, robust movement that includes everyone who's willing to dismantle this thing called racism and white supremacy. But on the flip side too, if I can say real quick, just as much as Black folk have been invested in building up Black men to make them men, we see also that white communities have done the same and do the same. And often there's a dialogue between the two, that when there seems to be a spike in one, there's a response by the other, and there's a spike in the other, and the other one responds too. So there's this tension between who's gonna be the man in this situation, right? And so we see that with this marriage between nationalism, narcissism, and nihilism that is coming out of the presidency, that's coming out of the White House, and is being supported by many of his supporters, right? So that there's a redemption effort of white manhood as well that we're watching right now. And hopefully we'll see protesters' efforts to check that as well.
Right, to check that. You mean the calling of the soldiers, you know, to the streets. Yeah, and the use of the Bible, the use of religion too. Talk to us a little bit about that, since your wonderful piece that began our show was based on Isaiah. So here's the use of religion that is also what seems problematic.
Right. I think we should be honest with ourselves that politics, that religion is political, and politics is religious, and has been for so many groups across time, not just in this moment. But what shocked me is, the Bible as a prop, right? But to keep in mind too that in so many ways, the Bible is functioning as a prop for other so-called leaders who mobilize the rhetoric when they're able to cite specific verses. In this case, we didn't get that recitation.
Right.
Maybe
because it was being held upside down. I don't know.
Perhaps, I would have asked for a favorite verse. I mean, even if we recited the most common ones, Jesus wept, the shortest, sort of the easy ones, right? But even, that was metaphorical. I think that the Bible was upside down, and maybe that's how a lot of people are holding it. Maybe that's how a lot of people are reading it. And so if we look at a verse like Isaiah 54:17, the name of that piece, how do we put in context the violence that happens against Black bodies, their citizenship, their humanity, not only in terms of physical violence, but also political, discursive, social, psychological violence, right? So there are some people who are not willing to be physically violent, but there are some people who are willing to strip you of your rights and vote in violent ways, right?
I'm so appreciative of your words and your understanding. One of the things that's come out of all of this is a young boy. His name is Kedron Bryant, 12 years old. 12 years old. Let's take a listen to, his song that he understands what's at stake here. His life is at stake. Right. Let's just listen to Kedron.
I'm a young Black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.
So for our children as well, our Black boys and our Black girls in danger, they understand it. That's what swept through our, our young people, because it's impossible for them to be protected from this information and from this danger. So as we are in our closing minutes, what you would say to young people, to families, as they look at all of this chaos in the streets?
Yeah, I think young people are trying to process this moment. And it's a generation of young people that we previously had dismissed for being apathetic and disengaged, right? And they're the ones leading this movement. So I think much credit is due. And I think at this point to say, stay informed, stay encouraged, and stay engaged. And I think it's the role now of an older generation to provide some tips to fall back in terms of the leadership. We have group-centered leadership at this point, but that doesn't mean you fall back from giving advice, from giving counseling and giving support, however you can,
right?
For a generation who are picking up the torch and taking it to the next step.
To Weston Haywood. Dr. Haywood, thank you so much. The book is called Let Us Make Men. I suggest that you get a copy. It's revelatory and important for us to read during these times. Thank you so much, Dr. Haywood. Thank you for watching us today. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and we will see you the next time.